There's a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a name. It's not the grief of losing someone to death or distance. It's the grief of realizing slowly over years that the people who were supposed to love you equally never really did. And the worst part? You spent most of your life convincing yourself you were imagining it. My name is Mara. I'm 31 years old, and 6 months ago I found out that my parents had signed over the family home. The house I grew up in, the house my grandmother left to our family, the house with the oak tree in the backyard that I used to climb when I needed to feel like I existed, to my sister. Completely. Without telling me. Without asking me. Without even the basic human courtesy of a conversation. But here's the part that stopped me cold in the middle of a grocery store parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon when I got the notification from the county property records I'd signed up for years ago and completely forgotten about. My name was still on the deed. They forgot to take it off. And that single tiny oversight, that one clerical slip, was about to unravel 17 years of carefully constructed family mythology. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with a document or a betrayal or a legal record. It starts the way most quiet devastations do, so slowly you almost miss it. It starts with a dining room table and the particular way silence can fill a room when only one person in it feels invisible. I grew up in a house in Ohio. Nothing remarkable about it from the outside. Beige siding, 2-car garage, a front porch that collected leaves every fall and nobody ever really swept. My parents, Ruth and Gerald, had 2 daughters. Me, and my younger sister, Danielle. Danielle was the kind of child that rooms reorganized themselves around. She had this laugh, full and bright and completely unself-conscious, and she walked into spaces like she already knew she belonged there. Which she did, I suppose. She always did. I don't say this with hatred, not anymore anyway. I say it because it's the truest way I know to describe what it felt like to grow up alongside her. Like being a supporting character in someone else's story while genuinely not understanding where your own story had gone. I was quieter. More careful. I read a lot, spent a lot of time in my room, got good grades without much praise for them. Danielle's B- on a spelling test would earn a trip to Applebee's. My straight A report card would earn a "that's great, honey," and a return to whatever was on television. I remember noting this, even as a child, turning it over in my mind, trying to understand the math of it, wondering what I was doing wrong. My mother would tell you she loved us equally. She believed that, I think. That's the complicated thing about this kind of favoritism. It doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from something more confused than that. Danielle was the easier child to love, maybe. More expressive. More openly affectionate. She asked for things directly, and so she received things directly. I didn't ask. I waited. I watched. And waiting and watching, I learned early on, got you nothing in that house except more time alone with your own thoughts. By the time I was in high school, the pattern was so established it had its own gravity. Danielle needed new clothes for homecoming. That was a whole Saturday afternoon at the mall and lunch and laughter and bags carried to the car. I needed new shoes for a school presentation. My mother handed me her credit card without looking up from the stove. I bought the shoes alone. I gave the presentation alone. Nobody asked how it went. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the foundation, the long, slow erosion of something, before you can understand what happened when it finally collapsed. I left for college at 18 and didn't come back to live there again. I built something small but mine in Columbus. An apartment with south-facing windows, a job I was genuinely good at, a therapist I saw on Thursday evenings who helped me put language to things I'd spent years pretending I hadn't felt. I visited home for holidays. I smiled at the right moments. I watched Danielle get her rent paid, her car insurance covered, her credit card debt quietly absorbed by my parents without fanfare, as if it were just the natural order of things. I told myself it didn't bother me. That was a lie I told myself for a very long time. The house came up maybe 2 years ago, at Thanksgiving. My grandmother, my father's mother, Nana Bet, had originally owned the property. When she passed, she left it to my parents with the informal understanding, stated in letters and conversations I had personally witnessed, that it would eventually go to both her granddaughters equally. That was the language she used. Both. Equally. I remember her saying it at her kitchen table over coffee when I was 19, her hands wrapped around a mug with a cardinal on it. That house is for both of you girls. That's how I want it. At Thanksgiving, my mother mentioned, almost offhandedly, that they were looking into some estate planning. She said it the way people say they're looking into getting the gutters cleaned. Routine. Procedural. Nothing to look at here. I asked calmly if that included the house. She said yes, they were getting everything organized. I asked if I should be involved in that process in any way. She looked at my father. Just for a second. That look. And then she smiled and said, "Oh, we'll take care of everything, don't worry." I should have pressed. I know that now. I should have asked more directly, hired someone, requested documentation. But I was so practiced at not pressing, at accepting the smile and the dismissal, at convincing myself I was being paranoid and oversensitive, that I just nodded. I helped clear the dishes. I drove home in the dark and told myself everything was fine. 8 months later, sitting in a grocery store parking lot with frozen vegetables melting in the trunk, my phone buzzed with a property record alert. The deed had been transferred. Danielle's name was on it. And so, somehow, was mine. I sat there for a long time. Cars moved around me. Someone honked at someone else in the distance. The frozen vegetables quietly became room temperature. And something that had been sleeping in me for 31 years opened its eyes. The first thing I did was screenshot it. 3 times. I don't know why 3 times. Some panicked instinct, like if I only took one the evidence might disappear, might rearrange itself into something more innocent. Then I sat there and read it again. And again. The address was right. The parcel number was right. Danielle's name was listed as primary owner. And there below hers, like an afterthought, like something left in a coat pocket and forgotten, my name. Maura Ellen Voss. Still attached to a property I had never been told was being transferred in the first place. I didn't call my mother that night. I want you to understand what kind of restraint that took, because my whole body was vibrating the entire drive home. I kept both hands on the wheel and I breathed through my nose and I thought about my therapist, Dana, and the specific way she had taught me to slow down before reacting. To get information before getting emotional. To understand the full shape of something before deciding how to respond to it. So instead of calling, I researched. I'm an administrative coordinator for a mid-sized property management company. I know more about deeds and titles and transfer documents than most people would ever want to. I know what a quitclaim deed looks like. I know the difference between joint tenancy and tenants in common. I know that if 2 names appear on a deed, both parties have legal standing, and neither party can sell, refinance, or transfer that property without the other's signature. I sat at my kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning with my laptop open and a notepad beside me, and I started writing down everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. The next morning I called the county recorder's office before work. A woman named Patricia answered, and I explained what I'd found and asked if I could get a copy of the transfer documentation. She was helpful and matter-of-fact in the way that government office employees sometimes are, all procedural warmth, and she told me the documents would be available for download within 24 hours. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my car in the work parking lot for 4 minutes before I trusted myself to go inside. The documents came through the following afternoon. I downloaded them, printed them at the office supply store on my lunch break, and sat in a corner booth at a diner 2 blocks away with a cup of coffee I barely touched. The quitclaim deed was there. Signed by both my parents. Notarized. Dated 7 months ago, the February after that Thanksgiving, the one where my mother had smiled and told me not to worry. Danielle's name was listed as grantee. Primary. Sole intended recipient, based on everything about how the document was structured. My name appeared on a separate line, and I stared at it for a long time trying to understand how it had gotten there. It didn't have the same formatting as Danielle's entry. It looked, honestly, like it had been added and then someone had meant to remove it and simply hadn't. A clerical error in the truest sense. My parents had likely never even noticed. Which meant they had transferred the house to my sister and genuinely believed they had done so completely, without leaving me any stake in it whatsoever. They hadn't told me. They hadn't asked me. They had made a unilateral decision about an asset that my own grandmother had said was meant for both of us, and they had simply done it, quietly, in February, while I was in Columbus living my life and trusting that my family was not actively working to erase me from something I was entitled to. I folded the papers carefully, put them in a manila envelope, put the envelope in my work bag, and I sat with that for another 2 days before I called Dana. Our Thursday session that week ran 20 minutes over. I remember Dana being very still in the way she gets when something I'm saying is landing as significant. She asked me how I felt, which seemed almost too small a question for what was in the room, but I tried to answer it honestly. I told her I felt vindicated in a way that made me sad. That every time I'd felt overlooked in that family, every time I told myself I was being too sensitive, every dinner where I'd watched my sister receive and watched myself wait, all of it suddenly had a document attached to it. All of it was suddenly, formally, real. Dana asked me what I wanted to do, and I told her I didn't know yet. But I knew I wasn't going to do nothing. Here's something about Danielle that I've never said out loud to anyone, that I'm saying now because the truth of this story requires it. Danielle is not a villain. I need you to hold that alongside everything else, because it matters. She's not calculating in the way that word implies. She doesn't wake up in the morning and plot. What she does, what she has always done, is simply exist at the center of my parents' attention and accept, without question, everything that comes from being there. She's never had to develop the muscle of self-awareness about it because nobody in that family ever asked her to. My parents never said, "Wait, is this fair?" They just gave. And she just received. And I just watched. When we were teenagers, there was a specific incident I think about sometimes. I had been saving for 6 months to buy a second-hand camera. I was really into photography for a while junior year. And the week before I had enough money, my parents bought Danielle a brand new one. Not because she'd asked for one particularly. Someone at school had one and mentioned it, and my mother thought it would be fun for her. I came downstairs that Saturday morning, and it was sitting in front of Danielle at the breakfast table, still in the box, tissue paper everywhere. I stood in the doorway. I looked at the camera. I looked at Danielle, who was genuinely, purely delighted, completely unaware of what that box meant in the context of my savings account. And I looked at my parents, who were smiling at her smile, absorbed entirely in that moment. And then I went upstairs and put my savings away and told myself the camera thing had just been a coincidence of bad timing. I never bought one. I stopped being interested in photography not long after that. I've thought about why, over the years. I think loving something in that house felt risky. If you wanted something visibly enough, it had a way of becoming complicated. So I learned to want things quietly, to build things privately, to become someone who didn't need the room to reorganize around her, because she'd found her own room. The problem with that survival skill is that it can look, from the outside, like you don't need anything at all. I wonder sometimes if that's what my parents saw. Not an overlooked daughter but a self-sufficient one. Not someone being quietly starved of recognition, but someone who seemed fine, always fine, indefinitely fine. I wonder if the story they told themselves was that I didn't need the house the way Danielle did. That I was stable where she was struggling. That it was practical, even kind, to give it to her. I wonder that. And then I think about the fact that they never asked me. That they never sat me down and said, here's what we're thinking. Is this okay? Do you understand? Do you have questions? That they simply did it, in February, while I wasn't looking, and expected the shape of the world to rearrange itself without me noticing. And I think, no, that's not practicality. That's not even favoritism in the complicated, forgivable sense. That's erasure. Quiet, complete, documented erasure. My grandmother had said both. Equally. They had decided they knew better. And they had, accidentally, catastrophically, left my name on the paperwork. I didn't contact a lawyer immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think people assume that when you discover something like this, you move fast and hard and certain. But I didn't. I spent almost 3 weeks just living with the information, carrying it around in the manila envelope in my work bag, taking it out sometimes at night and reading through the documents again, not because I needed to relearn what they said, but because I needed to keep confirming it was real, that I wasn't misreading something, that I hadn't constructed an injustice out of ordinary paperwork. That's what years of being told you're too sensitive does to you. It makes you audit your own perceptions constantly. It makes you the least reliable narrator of your own life. But the documents were clear. And after 3 weeks I made an appointment with a real estate attorney named Carla, who had a small office above a dry cleaner on the east side of Columbus, and a manner that was direct without being cold. I brought the manila envelope. I brought my notes. I brought the printed county records and the copy of my grandmother's informal letter, the one where she'd used the word both, that I had kept in a file box under my bed for 12 years without fully understanding why I'd kept it. Carla read everything carefully. She asked a few clarifying questions. And then she leaned back in her chair and told me, in plain language, that as a named co-owner on the deed I had full legal standing. That the property could not be sold, transferred, or refinanced without my consent and signature. That the error, whatever its origin, was now legally binding. That I had, without anyone intending it, a 50% stake in a house that my parents had tried to give entirely to someone else. I asked her what my options were. She gave me several. We talked through each one. I took notes in the margins of my notepad in handwriting that got progressively smaller as the appointment went on, which is something that happens when I'm concentrating hard and also trying not to cry. I didn't cry in Carla's office. I waited until I got to my car. Then I sat there for a while. Not devastated, exactly. Something more complicated than that. There was grief in it, yes, the grief of confirmation, of having the worst version of a story proved true. But there was something else underneath the grief that I didn't have a clean word for yet. Something that felt, dangerously, like power. I drove home. I made dinner. I did not call my mother. What I did instead was start paying attention in a different way. For years my attention in that family had been trained inward, monitoring my own reactions, managing my own hurt, making sure I didn't take up too much space or ask for too much or show the full extent of what I was feeling. Now I started directing it outward. I started noticing things I'd filed away without examining. Like the fact that Danielle had mentioned, casually, at Christmas the year before, that she was thinking about doing something with the house eventually. I'd assumed she meant renovating. Now I turned that sentence over with different hands. Like the fact that my mother, in the past year, had started asking questions about my savings during phone calls. Just conversationally, just checking in, but with a frequency and specificity that felt less like maternal interest and more like someone building a mental picture of what I had and what I didn't. Like the fact that my father, who was not an emotionally communicative man under any circumstances, had called me in March, 1 month after the deed transfer, to tell me he was proud of me. Out of nowhere. No context. A phone call that lasted 4 minutes and left me feeling vaguely unsettled in a way I couldn't explain at the time. Now I could explain it. It was guilt. The low-grade, managed guilt of someone who has done something they know is wrong but has already convinced themselves it was necessary. I called my cousin Reese around this time. Reese is my father's sister's daughter, 2 years older than me, and she has always occupied a useful position in the extended family. Far enough removed to be objective, close enough to know where the bodies were buried. She and I had grown up together at holidays, grown closer in adulthood in the way that sometimes happens with cousins when you both need someone who knew you before you became who you are now. I told Reese what I'd found. Not everything, not yet, but enough. I told her about the deed transfer, about Danielle's name, about my name still being there. There was a pause on her end. Then she said very carefully, "Maura, how long have you known about the plan?" I asked her what plan. Another pause. Longer this time. It turned out that Reese had been at a family dinner in the fall. My father's side, the kind of gathering I was rarely invited to with any real insistence, where the house had been discussed. Not secretly, apparently, openly, matter-of-factly. The plan had been laid out like it was already decided, which it was, because the conversation Reese was describing had happened in October, for months before the February transfer. My parents had been talking about giving the house to Danielle for at least that long. Possibly longer. Reese had assumed I knew. She had assumed there had been a conversation, a family meeting, some version of being told. She'd thought it was settled and agreed upon. She had no idea I was finding out now, from a property records alert, in a parking lot. I asked her what the reason was. What had been said at this dinner about why. She was quiet for a moment. Your dad said Danielle needed stability. That she'd been struggling financially. She paused. And that you were doing well enough that it wouldn't really matter to you. There it was. It wouldn't really matter to you. 17 years of being fine, always fine, indefinitely fine. And here was the bill for it. Here was what performing self-sufficiency in a family that was looking for a reason to overlook you actually cost. They had looked at my stability and my quiet and my asking for nothing, and they had decided it was permission. They had decided that needing nothing meant deserving nothing. I thanked Reese. I told her I was okay. I got off the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time, leaning against the counter with my arms crossed over my chest, looking at nothing. That was the night the something underneath, the grief sharpened into something clearer. I thought about Nana Bet. I thought about that kitchen table and that cardinal mug and her voice saying both, equally, like it was a thing she considered sacred. She had known something about fairness that her son had apparently forgotten, or chosen to set aside, or buried under the more comfortable story of who needed more. I thought about the camera, the Thanksgiving smile, the 4-minute phone call in March. I thought about Danielle, who I genuinely did not believe was the architect of any of this, who had probably just been told the house was hers and had accepted it the way she'd always accepted things, warmly and completely, without asking questions, because she had never had reason to learn that the things given to her might be complicated. And I thought, she doesn't know I'm on the deed. None of them do. I went to bed that night and I slept, which surprised me, deeply and without dreaming. Like something in my body had been waiting a long time to finally rest. Because for the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't the one being quietly maneuvered around. The situation had changed. Quietly, completely, by accident. The situation had changed. And I was the only one who knew it. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next, because I think it matters to the kind of person you understand me to be. I did not want revenge in the cinematic sense. I didn't want to blow anything up, didn't want tears at a dinner table, didn't want my sister humiliated or my parents publicly destroyed. That's not who I am. I had spent too many years in therapy learning the difference between justice and cruelty to confuse the two now. What I wanted was acknowledgement. Honest, direct, uncomfortable acknowledgement. I wanted someone in that family to sit across from me and say, yes, we did this, and we knew it wasn't right, and we're sorry. That's what I wanted. Just that. The thing that should have cost nothing and somehow, in that particular family, had always been the most expensive thing of all. But I had learned, slowly and at significant personal cost, that wanting something from people who have spent years not seeing you is a different project than simply asking for it. You cannot want your way into being seen by people who have decided what you are. You have to change the conditions of the conversation. So I waited. And while I waited, I prepared. Carla and I had 2 more meetings over the following weeks. We talked through every scenario methodically. She explained what a partition action was, a legal process where co-owners who can't agree on property use can force a sale or division, with proceeds split according to ownership stakes. She explained that as a 50% owner I was entitled to half the assessed value of the property if it were sold, or half the rental income if it were being leased, or simply to hold my stake indefinitely, which created what she called a cloud on the title, meaning the property could not be cleanly transferred, sold, or used as collateral for any loan without my cooperation. That last part was important in ways I was only beginning to understand. Because Danielle, it turned out, was not planning to simply live in the house. In early April, about 6 weeks after I'd found the deed record, she posted on her social media about a home renovation project she was excited to begin. Photos of paint swatches. A tagged post about a contractor she'd hired for a kitchen remodel. A comment from my mother underneath it. So exciting, can't wait to see it come together, with a little red heart. I looked at those photos for a long time. The renovation estimate she eventually mentioned, in a later post, was significant. The kind of number that suggests a home equity line of credit, not personal savings. The kind of project you finance against the value of a property you believe you own outright. I called Carla the next morning. She confirmed what I'd suspected. Any attempt to use the house as collateral for financing would require a title search. Any title search would immediately surface my name. The cloud on the title would stop the process entirely until my ownership stake was resolved. The renovation hadn't started yet. The contractor posts were still in the planning phase. I had time. I decided to tell my parents first. That felt important. Not for strategic reasons, though there were strategic reasons, but because I was not willing to be the kind of person who let her family walk into a wall without warning. Whatever they had done, they were still my parents. Nana Betty's son was still in there somewhere. I owed him at least a conversation before anything became formal. I called my mother on a Sunday morning in late April. She answered on the second ring, sounding warm and distracted the way she always did, like she was simultaneously happy to hear from you and mildly occupied with something more pressing. I told her I needed to talk about the house. A brief pause. Just a breath's worth. What house, honey? That sentence. I have thought about that sentence a lot since. What house? Honey. 2 words of deflection wrapped around 1 word of false tenderness. I felt it land in my chest like a small stone dropped from a height. I said, Nana Betty's house. The one on Claremont. I told her I'd seen the deed transfer. Longer pause this time. How did you? She stopped. Started again. Where did you see that? I explained the property records alert. I kept my voice even. I had practiced this, actually, in my car 2 nights before, which sounds strange maybe but was one of the more useful things I've ever done for myself. I had said the words out loud alone in the dark until they stopped shaking. My mother was quiet for a moment that stretched in a way that told me she was deciding something. And then she said, and I want you to hear the specific shape of this, she said. We were going to tell you. We just wanted to get everything settled first so there wouldn't be confusion. I asked her what kind of confusion she'd been worried about. She said, you know how these things can get emotional. I sat with that for a second. The idea that they had avoided telling me specifically to prevent emotional difficulty. That the solution to a situation that might upset me had been to exclude me from it entirely. And that this was being presented, in this moment, as consideration. I said, "Mom, my name is on the deed." Silence. I said it again, more clearly. I said, "When the transfer was filed, my name wasn't removed. I'm currently listed as a co-owner with Danielle." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This one had a texture. I could feel her recalibrating on the other end of the line, processing what that meant, what it changed, what it threatened. She said, "That must be a mistake." I said I understood it was unintentional. I said I had spoken with an attorney about what it meant legally. I said I wasn't calling to make threats, but that I needed us to have an honest conversation about what had been decided and why, because I had been left out of a decision about property my grandmother had specifically intended for both of us, and I needed that to be acknowledged. My mother's voice changed. It got smaller and tighter and careful. She said she needed to talk to my father and that she'd call me back. She did not call me back that Sunday. Or Monday. I called my father Tuesday evening. He answered, and I could tell from the first syllable that he'd been waiting for it. That he'd known it was coming and had been sitting in the discomfort of that anticipation for 2 days. He sounded, underneath the careful composure, like a man who was tired in a very specific way. The tired of someone who knows they've done something they can't cleanly defend. He said, "Maura, your mother told me about your call." I said yes. He said, "We made the decision we thought was best for the family." I asked him whose family he meant. He didn't answer that directly. He said Danielle had been going through a hard time. That she needed something stable. That he and my mother felt the house was the right way to help her. That they had always known I was capable of taking care of myself. I said, "Dad," Nanabet said, "both of us. Equally. I have a letter where she says that." He said, "Your grandmother isn't here anymore, Maura." That sentence. I want you to really sit with that one. Your grandmother isn't here anymore. As if the wishes of the dead dissolve the moment they're inconvenient. As if the woman who had built something and loved her granddaughters and said both and meant it had simply surrendered her meaning along with her pulse. I felt something in me go very still. I said, "I know she isn't. But I am." And I told him that I was not going to sign anything releasing my stake in the property until we had a real conversation, all four of us, about what had happened and why. That I wasn't asking for a fight. That I was asking for the one thing I had always asked for in that family and never received, which was to be treated like I was there. My father said he understood. He said they would talk and be in touch. He sounded, just before he hung up, like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't expected to find there. Like someone who had built a version of events in which no one got hurt and was only now beginning to understand that the version had been wrong. Good, I thought, when the call ended. That feeling I'd been struggling to name for weeks finally had a word. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't even satisfaction. Not exactly. It was clarity. And clarity, in a family that had built itself on comfortable fog, was the most disruptive thing I had ever introduced. I didn't know yet how disruptive. I didn't know that within 2 weeks Danielle would call me for the first time in 4 months, voice bright and confused, saying she'd just gotten a call from the contractor and something about the financing had hit a snag, and did I know anything about that? I didn't know that the conversation was coming. The one at the kitchen table. The one where everything that had been built on avoidance would finally have to sit in the open and be named. But I could feel it. The way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The atmosphere of the family shifting. Everyone suddenly aware that the ground under the comfortable story had changed. And underneath that awareness, for the first time in 31 years, it was me they were going to have to reckon with. The call from Danielle came on a Thursday. I remember because I was getting ready for my session with Dana and I almost let it go to voicemail, and then something made me pick up. Some instinct that said this is part of it, answer it, be present for it. Her voice was the way it always was, Warm and a little breezy, that particular quality she had of making everything sound like it was probably fine and would definitely work out. But underneath the warmth there was something tighter than usual. A frequency I hadn't heard from her before, or maybe had heard and hadn't known how to read until now. She said the contractor had flagged something with the title company. She said the financing for the renovation had been paused. She said, with a careful lightness that cost her something, that apparently there was some kind of issue with the deed. I said yes. I told her I knew about the issue. Silence. Different from my mother's silence. Different from my father's. Danielle's silence had confusion in it. Genuine confusion. And something that might have been the beginning of understanding arriving somewhere it hadn't been before. She said, "Mara, what's going on?" And I told her. Not everything, not all at once, but the essential shape of it. I told her my name was on the deed. I told her I'd found out from a property records alert. I told her I'd spoken with an attorney. I said it all the way I'd practiced saying the hard things. Evenly, without theater, without the shaking I used to let live in my voice when I talked about anything that mattered in that family. The silence after I finished was long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she said, "They told me it was handled." 3 words I've thought about a lot since. Not I didn't know. Not that's not fair. Not even I'm sorry. They told me it was handled. Which told me everything about how much Danielle had questioned it, which was not very much, and everything about how much she'd needed to question it, which according to the family logic she'd always lived inside was also not very much. Things were given to her. They were handled. The machinery of parental favoritism had always run quietly enough that she'd never had to look at the gears. I told her I wasn't angry at her. I meant it. I want you to believe that I meant it, because I think it's the most important thing I did in that entire sequence of events. I told my sister, who was sitting on the other end of a phone call holding a renovation plan built on a house she'd been given without my knowledge, that my anger was not directed at her. That I understood she hadn't designed this. That what I needed was not to take something from her, but to be part of a conversation I had never been included in. She was quiet again. And then she said, in a voice that was smaller than I'd ever heard from her, "I didn't know you weren't told." I believed her. I still believe her. We talked for 40 minutes. I missed my session with Dana, who I texted afterward with a brief explanation, and who responded with a single line that said that sounds like it was the more important appointment. Danielle asked questions I answered honestly. I asked questions she answered the same way. For the first time in our adult lives we were talking directly about the thing that had always lived between us, unnamed and unexamined, given shape finally by a document neither of us had originally known about. At the end of the call, she said she wanted to talk to our parents. That she had questions for them that had nothing to do with the deed. I heard something in that. A door opening in her that I don't think had been open before. An awareness arriving, slowly and not without pain, that the story she'd been the center of had edges she hadn't looked at. The 4-person conversation happened 10 days later. My mother had suggested a phone call. I said no, I'd prefer in person, and I drove to Ohio on a Saturday morning in May with my manila envelope on the passenger seat and Dana's voice in my head, reminding me that I was allowed to take up space in that room. The house looked the same from the outside. Beige siding. 2-car garage. The front porch with its permanent suggestion of unswept leaves. I sat in the driveway for a moment and looked at the oak tree visible over the roofline in the backyard. And I thought about the girl who used to climb it when she needed to feel like she existed. And I thought, she existed. She always existed. She's sitting in this car right now. Then I went inside. My parents were in the living room. My mother was on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, the posture she used when she was bracing for something. My father was in his chair, and he looked older than I remembered, which I noticed the way you notice things you've been too guarded to notice before. Danielle was on the love seat. She looked at me when I came in with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not quite guilt, not quite sorrow, something in between that made her look, for the first time, like she and I were in the same room in the same way. I sat down. I put the manila envelope on the coffee table, but I didn't open it. My mother spoke first. She said they wanted to explain. She said it had been a difficult decision, and they had agonized over it, and they had ultimately done what they thought was right for the family. She said Danielle had been struggling. She listed things, real things, financial difficulties, and a hard few years, and they had felt the house was the most meaningful way they could help. She said they had always known I was strong enough to manage without it. She said this gently. She said it like it was a compliment. I let her finish. I let the whole thing land in the room and sit there. Then I said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really answer it. Not the answer that makes the story comfortable. The actual answer. My mother nodded. I said, did it ever occur to either of you to ask me? Not to tell me. Not to explain your decision after you'd made it. Just to ask. To say, we're thinking about this. How do you feel? Does this seem fair to you? Are you okay with this? My father looked at the floor. My mother opened her mouth and then closed it. I said, I've been asking that question my whole life, by the way. Not out loud. I learned early on that asking out loud in this family didn't get you very far. But I've been asking it every time you drove Danielle to the mall and handed me a credit card. Every time her B- was a celebration and my A's were background noise. Every time I visited home and felt like a guest in a house that was supposed to be half mine by your own mother's explicit wishes. The room was very quiet. Danielle was looking at her hands. I said, I'm not here to punish anyone. I have legal standing on that property and I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with it. But I'm not signing anything and I'm not making any decisions until I hear something real from you. Not the version where you were just helping Danielle. The real version. Where you made a choice about what I deserved and you made it without me. My father looked up. His eyes were wet, which I had seen maybe twice in my entire life, and the sight of it did something complicated to my chest. He said, we thought you didn't need it. I said, I know you did. That's the part one needed you to say. He said very quietly, that wasn't fair to you. 4 words. Just 4. I had waited 31 years for something in that approximate shape, and here it was, small and insufficient and real, said by a man who looked like he was only now, at this late hour, understanding the full cost of the shorthand he'd used his whole life to avoid the harder work of seeing me. My mother started crying. Not performatively, genuinely, quietly, in a way that surprised me. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't realized how much had accumulated. That she'd told herself the story of the capable daughter and the struggling daughter so many times it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like fact. I said, I know. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. Danielle looked up then. She said, I'm going to talk to them. After this. About everything. Not just the house. I looked at my sister. Really looked at her. The way I hadn't let myself in years. And I saw someone who had been handed a world and was only now being asked to look at the shape of what it had cost. She wasn't hardened. She wasn't defensive. She looked uncertain in a way that was new and, I thought, probably good for her. We talked for 2 more hours. Not everything got resolved. Nothing as old and layered as what lived in that family resolves in a single Saturday afternoon. But things were said that hadn't been said, and heard in ways they hadn't been heard, and the comfortable fog that had held the whole structure together for decades had burned off enough that everyone in the room could finally see the actual furniture. Before I left, my father asked what I wanted to do about the property. I told him I'd been thinking about it. I said I didn't want to force a sale. I didn't want to append Danielle's life out of bitterness when bitterness wasn't actually what I felt. I said what I wanted was for my stake to be formally acknowledged, for the deed to reflect the reality as it currently stood, and for whatever happened next to happen with everyone at the table this time. He nodded. He said that was fair. I picked up the manila envelope. I walked to the door. And then I stopped, because there was one more thing, and I had promised myself I would say it. I turned back and I looked at both of them and I said, I'm not going to keep performing fine when I'm not fine. I'm not going to shrink myself to make the room more comfortable. I love you both and I want a relationship with you, and I need that relationship to be one where I'm actually in it. Not the idea of me that's convenient. Me. My mother said, okay. My father said, okay. It wasn't everything. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in a very long time, I drove home from Ohio without the particular weight I'd carried there every single time before. The weight of the invisible daughter, trying not to take up too much space in a car traveling away from a house that had never quite felt like hers. The weight was still there, a little. These things don't vanish in an afternoon. But it was lighter. Measurably, meaningfully lighter. And the oak tree in the backyard was just starting to come into full leaf as I pulled out of the driveway, green and enormous and completely indifferent to the human drama underneath it, the way trees always are, the way I had always loved about them. The months after that Saturday have a different quality in my memory than the years before them. The years before have a kind of muffled texture, like trying to remember music heard through a wall. Recognizable but muted. The months after are clearer. Not easier, necessarily. Clarity and ease are not the same thing, and I think one of the quiet lies we tell ourselves about healing is that it feels good the whole way through. It doesn't. Sometimes it feels like surgery. Necessary and correct and deeply uncomfortable. The formal legal resolution took about 8 weeks. Carla drafted an agreement that acknowledged my co-ownership stake and outlined a path forward that everyone could live with. The arrangement we landed on was this. Danielle would remain the primary resident of the property. My stake would be formally documented and valued. In exchange for not pursuing partition or forcing a sale, my parents would establish a separate financial account in my name, drawn from their own assets, not Danielle's, equivalent to half the current assessed value of the property. Not a gift. Not charity. A correction. The language we used in the document, which was Carla's suggestion and which I appreciated more than I told her, was equalization of inheritance. My parents agreed without significant pushback, which told me something. People who genuinely believe they've done nothing wrong tend to fight harder. The relative quiet of their compliance was its own kind of admission. Danielle and I talked several more times during those 8 weeks. Long phone calls, sometimes, the kind we had never had before in our adult lives, where neither of us was performing for the other or for the idea of sisterhood we'd both been quietly maintaining from a distance. We talked about the camera, which I brought up one night half expecting her to have no memory of it. She remembered. She said she hadn't understood at the time what it meant and that thinking about it now made her feel sick. I told her I didn't need her to feel sick about it. I just needed her to know it had happened. She said she understood. I believed her. We talked about our childhoods in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes unexpectedly funny. The particular dark comedy of two people raised in the same house discovering they had experienced almost entirely different childhoods within it. The things she hadn't known about. The things I hadn't known she didn't know. The mutual revelation that the family we'd each constructed in our own minds had been, in some significant ways, a fiction built to make the reality navigable. She asked me once, carefully, if I hated her. I told her no. That what I had felt for most of my life wasn't hate. It was something lonelier than that. A kind of sustained invisibility that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with a dynamic that was already in place before either of us was old enough to understand it or choose differently within it. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I've been thinking about therapy." I told her I thought that was a genuinely good idea. She laughed a little. I laughed a little. It was small and imperfect and real. My relationship with my parents changed in ways I'm still mapping. My mother calls more often now, and the calls are different. Less performance, more attempt. She asks questions she didn't use to ask. How are you really? What's going on with you lately? She doesn't always know what to do with the answers, but she's asking, which is more than she did before, and I have learned to receive imperfect effort as the thing it is rather than holding it up against the standard of what I always wished she'd been. That's not resignation. That's just the particular mathematics of loving people who are trying late. My father is quieter about it, which is consistent with who he's always been. He doesn't call as often as my mother, but when he does the calls are longer. He asks about my work. He told me 2 months after the Saturday in Ohio that he'd been thinking about what I said about Nana Bet. That he'd been going back over her letters. He said she'd been right, and that he should have honored what she meant rather than reinterpreting it to fit what was easier. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Some apologies live in the space around the words rather than in the words themselves, and I have gotten better at hearing those. I went back to the house in July. Not for any formal reason, the legal matters were settled by then, but because Danielle invited me for a weekend and I said yes. The renovation had moved forward, finally, once the title was clear. The kitchen was different. New counters, different light fixtures, a window above the sink that hadn't been there before, and that let in the afternoon light in a way that changed the whole character of the room. I stood in that kitchen and felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was that it was fine. That Danielle living there was fine. That the house being hers in the daily practical sense, her coffee on the counter, her plants on the windowsill, her shoes by the back door, was not the wound it might have been if the story had ended differently. The wound had never really been about the house. The house was just the place where the wound had finally surfaced visibly enough to be treated. I climbed the oak tree while I was there. Not high. I'm 31, not 11, and the tree has grown in ways that make the old route up different, but enough. I sat in the first good fork for a few minutes and looked at the backyard and the back of the house and the window of my old bedroom, and I thought about the girl who used to come out here when she needed to feel like she existed. I thought, she was right to come here. It worked. She existed then and she exists now, and the tree is still here and so is she. I came down and went inside, and Danielle had made dinner, something elaborate that she'd been excited about all day, and we ate at the kitchen table while the light changed outside the new window and talked about nothing important for 2 hours. It was the most ordinary evening I had spent in that house in my entire adult life. Ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they're no longer complicated by everything unspoken underneath them. I thought about what had made it possible. The property record alert. Patricia at the county recorder's office. Carla and her direct manner and her small office above the dry cleaner. Reese, who had told me the truth. Dana, who had spent years teaching me that my perceptions were not the problem. The letter in the file box under my bed that I had kept for 12 years without fully knowing why. And my own quiet, stubborn, decades-long refusal to fully disappear, even when everything around me was organized in a way that made disappearing the path of least resistance. I had not disappeared. That, I think, is the thing I'm most proud of. Not the legal outcome, not the equalization account, not even the Saturday in Ohio with the things finally said. The thing I'm most proud of is that I kept the file box. I kept the letter. I signed up for the property alert years ago and forgot about it but didn't cancel it. Some part of me, through everything, had kept one hand loosely on the thread. Had never fully let go of the idea that I was owed the truth of my own story. You are too. Whatever version of this you're living. And I know some of you are living some version of this, because these stories don't get told in vacuums, they get told because they're recognized. You are owed the truth of your own story. The fact that you've been fine doesn't mean you deserved less. The fact that you're quiet doesn't mean you have nothing to say. The fact that you've been invisible in a room doesn't mean you aren't there. You're there. You've always been there. Sometimes the proof is in a document someone forgot to correct. Sometimes it's somewhere less legible than that. But the proof exists. And you are allowed to find it. You are allowed to walk into the room, put the manila envelope on the table, and say, I'm not going to keep performing fine when I'm not fine. I'm here. I've always been here. And I'm not leaving. That's all I did, really. In the end, after all of it, the parking lot, the attorney, the phone calls, the Saturday in Ohio, the oak tree, the new kitchen window, that's all I did. I refused to leave the room. And it turned out that was enough. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Tell me if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or if someone finally saw you when they should have seen you all along. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, told honestly and without shortcuts. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they're not imagining it, that what they feel is real and they deserve to be in the room, share this with them. It might be exactly what they needed today. This story is inspired by real online experiences. Names, details, and situations may have been changed for storytelling and privacy purposes.